Welcome to the NeuroMarvels, another episode. Here we are. This is so fun. Hi, Dana Waters. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm Dana Waters. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Hey, Dana, we've got a really interesting topic today. I mean, maybe you can introduce it, and we'll just
Sure.
jump right in.
Sure. So what we're going to talk about today is called Rejection Sensitivity Dysphoria, or RSD. It's something that I didn't know about and got introduced to by the neurodiversity community. I never say that right. And so I was actually doing a little bit of research for today, because I've done memes on this, but I was doing a little bit more research. I haven't looked online in a while. And there's more literature showing up about it, which is great for our field. One of the things, the really interesting things that I read, that I caught myself in my own bias, which I always like catching myself, was an article that I'll get to defining it and talking about it a little bit in a minute. But the article said, it's not in the DSM, it's not in the ICD, but that doesn't mean it's not a real thing. And I was like, oh. So I think the psychologist part of me was a little bit, well, can it really be called a thing if it's not a diagnosis? And yes, it can. So that was like a watershed for me. But I first started hearing about this, the ADHD community has been talking about this much longer. And I think when they started talking about it more online and things like that, just neurodiverse folks in general were like, oh, that thing, that describes exactly how I'm feeling. And let me disarticulate all the pieces of it. So rejection, this would be someone actually rejecting you, a sense of like your peers don't want to be around you, or someone saying I don't like you, or it can be you're really attached to this little dog and you really want the dog to like you, and the dog turns around and isn't interested in you, right? That's a form of rejection. So rejection can be defined in a pretty wide swath, right?
It could even be your perception, right, Dana?
It can even be your perception, yeah.
It's like not actually happening, but that's the way you perceive something.
Right.
Okay.
So that's what I was going to say too. It's what we call real or imagined. They borrowed that language from trauma, real or imagined threat to self. So it can be a real or imagined. Rejection, sensitivity would be that you're more sensitive than some other people might be, or it hits you in a way like your defenses are less able to be resilient against it. So it is almost like a sensory sensitivity. It can be for some folks, in that you feel it, right? It isn't just like a cognitive thing, like, oh, that person doesn't like me. It's this really deep. It can be painful, like physically painful for some folks. It can feel really sad, and some people get angry about it. But there's that sensitivity piece that is almost like a neurological component to it. And then dysphoria, the best way I can describe dysphoria is that the opposite of dysphoria is euphoria. And everybody knows that euphoria is a wonderful feeling, right? Dysphoria is like the opposite of that. So imagine feeling just crappy in every way you can imagine dysphoria. And the dysphoria, I think, is a really good word that's been chosen, because for dysphoria, we tend to think of it being more, not just an in the moment thing, but something that kind of lasts, right? So you can have a real or imagined rejection from somebody, or an attachment disruption or something along those lines, and go into a really isolated, bad place that's hard to soothe from, or you can find soothing, but it's hard to pull up from, right? Sometimes it can last a few minutes. I've had it where it's lasted days. For me, it was almost like I didn't have this word rejection sensitivity dysphoria to use then, and it felt almost like a trauma fugue that you'll have with some people who go through a really bad trauma, that hits and you don't have any way to cope with it. But it seems to, in the stuff I've been reading, we seem to see it more in the neurodivergent community. Now, there's some hypotheses about it, just like something else that's newly defined. There's been some wondering if there's a genetic component, like does it come along with these neurodiverse types of genes? Is there a neurological, could be driven by genetics? And then if you think about people that are neurodiverse, whether they've known it or not when they were kids, are oftentimes like the weird kid or don't get 100% accepted socially. So some of it can be experience-based too, right? If you're the odd man out as a kid, you experience more rejection and you get primed to it, and you basically have more of a trauma base to it, right? Yeah. So that if you have a rejection when you're an adult and it happens to go to that place, you really feel it deeply, right? It just gets in your core, like you don't have the shield frequencies to, it's like movies when they're trying to get the bullets into the Enterprise and the shields are holding up. Your shields are down. It's all of the pelts are getting in there and they're hurting you and they're taking you down, right? Now, the dysphoria itself, the reaction to it is what we, let me say the words and then I'll explain them. They're out of proportion to what you'd expect. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. They're out of proportion to what the viewer outside of you would expect. And maybe even sometimes yourself. Maybe you're even surprising yourself how much it hit you. You're like, oh my God, this is really bothering me. Or, yeah, this really sucked. And everybody else around you is saying, it's not that big a deal. What's the problem? Or why are you reacting that way? If you are an adult and you have words to put to it, you can probably explain it to the other person about how you're feeling. But again, this maybe it's a function of me working with adults and you working with younger people more. We always seem to have that difference in developmental trajectory. I would imagine this would be the same with that, right? Mm-hmm. How do you process through it? How do you deal with it? The first time I ever felt it in that way that I described, it almost felt like a trauma fugue. I was in a work situation that really wasn't good for me. I was a little bit trapped. I'd actually applied for a job where I work now, was so excited about working here, waited. And then a colleague of mine who I was working with currently got an interview and I didn't. And so some of that was like my professional identity was wrapped up in that. It was, why am I not good enough? What did I do on my application? Or what kind of person am I that they chose that person and not me? And I was walking around, it was a version of shutdown. So I think the dysphoria, some will describe as autistic shutdown as well. Yeah. Not dissociative. You're aware of what's going on around you, but everything kind of feels muted, like you're walking through jello. And for me, it felt like my emotions were just going to this really kind of soft, muted place to protect me because it was so hurtful. I just felt like, I really like laying on the couch and just sort of staring into space or watching something I've seen 6,000 times today already felt really comforting. And I needed to wallow in it. This is the other thing about the dysphoria. Yes. You need to be seen in the wallow, like, oh, this is so terrible. I have a partner who's wonderful who was like, yes, I know it's so terrible. And are you okay? Do you need anything? But again, we tend to want to pull people out of these things too fast. And I think really it was a grieving of a real loss for me, was the emotional reaction to it out of proportion to the outside viewer. Maybe not at first, but this went on for like 3 days. So maybe someone would say, whoa, wait a minute, you're still in this place 3 days. You can hardly function. What's going on? But that's that dysphoria, right? Hard to come out of it. And I don't see a lot of people outside of the neurodiverse community talking about the light bulb going on with this thing. Yeah. But boy, people within it are like, if they've never heard about it, they're like, oh my God, I've had clients say, have you heard of this thing? And I'll be like, oh, yeah, actually I have. And they're like, I've never read about it before. Oh my God. It's like someone was following me around inside my head and they've written down what I was experiencing internally. So it's definitely a real thing. Complex trauma is something we've known about for years and years and years, and that's still not in the DSM. They've modified PTSD. So just the fact that it's not a diagnosis. I think really we need to make sure we know that it doesn't mean it's not a thing. And so if you're talking about a genetic root, maybe it's even based in neurology, and all these learned experiences of having really been not picked, or
Yeah.
shunned socially, and all these other kinds of things. So the fantasy goes to all these places of, oh, they don't like me. See, here it is again. I told you I shouldn't put myself out there. Why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep trying? Because I just get knocked down. How stupid am I for trying? I'm just never going to try again. So there's a bit of catastrophizing that happens with it, and that can stick. Or you just really need to, what I do with my clients is let them have that wallow time and stick with them, all of that. And then they usually do come out of it themselves, as long as I don't pull them out. I let them have that as long as they need to. And they might even say to me, why are you not telling me what to do to get out of this? And I'll say, because it's the timing and the way you do it is different for everybody. And I want you to know I see you in your suffering, and spending time in that. And that's what we do, like with a real loss. Like someone dies, we don't expect you to be happy the next day. We expect you to have a period of time where you're like in mourning. So that would be the closest neurotypical example I could give to how it feels. It feels like you've lost something that you
Something
loved.
significant.
Something really significant. Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Dana. It's so interesting because this term, this label.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a label.
It's a label, but and going back to our labelism episode, labels are good when they can serve a purpose and a function that's helpful, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes labels serve as a way to feel understood and seen because you didn't have the words or the framework to do that before, right?
Exactly.
As you're describing this, there are a few clients of mine that come immediately to mind. And it's so interesting because they've got these kind of twice exceptional profile. For those of you out there that don't know what twice exceptional is, it means that you're gifted in one aspect of your intelligence, your cognitive functioning, and there's a significant discrepancy between another. So, for example, maybe you have a high verbal IQ. You can understand and talk about things in these really beautiful, gifted ways, but your processing speed is significantly lower.
Yeah.
So it takes you a longer time to process. Like that's a 2E profile.
Yeah.
Or my ADHDers, my adults with ADHD, they experience this.
Oh, hell yeah.
And it's so interesting because as I'm trying to help them advocate in their systems of work, families, relationships.
Right.
The first phase, and I call this a phase whenever I experience this, and I didn't have the words for this as a therapist, so I'm really grateful for this, is let's let you have it.
Yeah.
Here's the piece, Dana, and I don't know if you can resonate with this as a therapist. And I think my younger therapist self is different than myself today. My younger therapist self would be worried that it would slide into a significant major depressive episode and then we'd get suicidal.
Oh, yeah, that's scary.
Right?
Yeah. See, right? I learned in models before I even went to graduate school in body therapies and psychodrama, where you actually you got out the Ambu bag and amped these flames. And so for me, I had to rein that in a little bit and say, well, maybe you should not let them hang out in that so long that they die. So for me, I never had that struggle that you've had. I tend to maybe go too far the other way.
But I see that because, the therapist-client relationship is so unique. And there's no other relationship like it.
Yeah.
So what is that line, as a therapist where you're like, how long do you need it before it goes harmful?
We keep going into the awareness thing with pretty much every episode. So I'm sorry if our followers are ready to just hit us about it.
Yeah.
And part of this is, especially if you're doing it, if you're in the space and you're alone, it's going to be really hard to have the awareness necessarily that this is what's happening. if you are talking to your therapist, or you have a partner or a family, a friend, or whoever, or your dog is like, God, take me outside, you've been on the couch for 8 hours. If you can have some sort of awareness that this is what's going on, then we can flip it to empowerment, to I'm going to let myself do this, right? I can remember when I had that reaction about not getting that interview, I had to function the next day, I had to teach. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, oh, okay, the weekend's coming up. I am going to spend Saturday, Sunday, and Monday doing, I made no plans. I told my wife, I don't want to do anything. I told my wife, I just need to cry and feel bad, and have a supportive spouse that would do that. But that was with awareness for that and knowing that's what I needed. So if you're not aware that's what's going on, the danger is you could catastrophize and have this sort of thinking about everything.
Yep.
And then it becomes pervasive. So that would be, even what I do with folks, if I do use some CBT and I have someone who is majorly depressed, we'll talk about that. What is in your purview to have efficacy and what isn't? How helpless do you feel, and how helpless do you need to feel? And I get in there and sort of split those hairs with folks, and then slowly build up the efficacy component so they feel like if they're in that place, it's by choice rather than it happening to them. I imagine with a kid that might be harder because they're not going to necessarily have that sort of language to use, but it seems to work pretty well for adults that and on myself, but adults that I work with. But if I'm going to let them wallow in it, I'll tell them, you need wallow time. I mean, I'll frame it as that so they know that.
Yeah. Hey, Dana, just for the audience, will you define, or will you help the audience understand efficacy? Because it's a psychological concept. I think is like pretty critical, anyway.
Yeah. Can I have an effect on something? Do I have a sense of agency to change something? And sometimes, especially in this place, it feels like you can't do anything. I remember when I first didn't get the interview here, one of the first things some of my colleagues said was, oh, it'll be fine. You'll get another job somewhere. Apply to other places. I'm like, that's the last thing I'm thinking about right now. I needed to be able to control things I could control. And I think that's why the wallowing, I'm going to choose to watch, a horrible, bad movie where half the characters die because I want the company of it. Or I'm going to choose to have just macaroni and cheese and Diet Coke all damn day.
Yum. Oh my God.
Yeah, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
So that's efficacy. It's about having choice, because you may not be able to control the thing you want to control, like getting an interview or having people like you or having someone not reject you. Right. I had a heartbreaking story told to me recently about someone who had a really close friendship with someone for years. And then they just one day said, I don't want to be your friend anymore. You make me anxious. I don't like you anymore. And I thought, an adult said that to you? Those are the kind of things like third graders say. But those kind of things can happen. And there was nothing that client could do to change that or control that. So now what can you control? And then also, validate the huge reaction that you'd expect to come from something like that, of course. Yep. And it's years later and they're still unpacking it, which is understandable.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, and I always feel like things linger because they still need some attention.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Of some kind. Yep. I think I said this to my daughter the other day, my teenage daughter. I was like, what you resist persists.
Yes.
And she was like, oh boy, here we go again.
Here we go.
Here we go. But this idea that it's tapping you on the shoulder. It's like, I'm not done yet. Like, help me resolve this. Help me heal from this. The other thing, Dana, that I think would be helpful for the audience is you talked about trauma-based responses. Maybe just drop a little bit of information about what that means.
Yeah, so there can be all kinds of pieces of it, but if you've been traumatized as a kid around these kinds of attachments, it's in a learned behavior. It has actually happened to you. So if something has actually happened to you and then it happens to you as an adult, you're going to tap into all those feelings that you tend to get with the trauma. It's going to access all those things that happened to you all those years if you haven't process those. It's going to be familiar, right? And it's going to, that could be some of the out of proportion that happens to you, because it sort of is like opening something you left in the refrigerator too long. It smells a lot worse because it's been in there uncovered or covered tight than something you've opened and let air out and things like that. And that's like the process of therapy. So some of these rejections are very real. And that if you have trauma for them, you're going to be less resilient to be able to just brush them off. They're going to hurt more because you have that learned experience already, right? No one wants to be rejected at all, but you're not going to have the resiliency to frame it in a way that is like, well, screw them then. That's something you have to get to. It's not going to happen automatically.
Especially if it's like a significant relationship when you're younger. So maybe that's a parent-child relationship where abandonment or rejection is occurring. I feel like when you get to be an adult and you didn't have those stable, trusting, safe, primary kind of relationships, there's a sensitivity to rejection.
Yeah, for sure.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
It's adaptive, right? So if I get rejected a lot, doesn't it make sense then when I get rejected that I'm going to say, oh, I'm not going to try to trust somebody again? Of course, you're going to go into your corner and say, well, forget it. I'm not going to do that again.
Screw you. Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to take my toys. I'm going to go into this corner and I don't need to share with anyone, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just much safer over here. And
that's right.
I like the word adaptive over protective because I think that, they both kind of ring true. And then for the audience, Dana, like, what is considered trauma? Because, I feel like this is another hot button today.
Yeah.
We have
what we call, our field uses this, and it bugs me a little bit because what bugs me, it doesn't bug me. So we talk about big T and little T. You knew what I was going to say. Yeah. And by big T, we mean things like, you are a soldier in Iran and you go through a horrible experience there as a result of being someone in war. That's a pretty obvious big T trauma, right? Little T traumas would be these things that are like slights that you have from people, or not something that the outside observer would, dub with a big T. That's where I have an issue with it, because a big T trauma to someone can be a huge, gigantic, skyscraper-sized T, but to somebody else, it's like they wouldn't even notice it. Yeah. Right. So I'll talk with my clients about that, what feels like these big Ts. And then what can also add to it becoming a big T is chronicity. So if you have a kid that is going through being abused by a parent, even if it's only happening once every 3 months or something like that, but that goes on for years, right? That cumulative effect can be a big T. I actually think that a ton of little T's, even if they're a bunch of little T's, haven't been dealt with, eventually clot together, and as an adult now you've got this big T thing, and they're all together and they're friends and they've figured out ways to take you down by joining together.
Oh, no, I imagine those in my mind. This is where my crazy mind goes. Like, how in Sesame Street, the letters have their own puppets? Like,
yes,
have, like, the little, their letters are alive, like they're on their own puppets.
Yeah,
and they've got
totally.
eyes. I see a lot of little T's, like overwhelming, someone, and it becomes like that big T.
It's like that school of fish that moves together and becomes one giant thing.
Giant.
Totally.
I think that's the piece for me. The issue here is, again, we're fighting with labels, because there's so many labels today.
Yeah, but we have to have them to kind of be able to talk about it, right?
Yeah. And it's really, I think labels serve as that talking point. It's a starting point.
Yeah.
It's not the end point, it's a start point. But that idea of trauma, is defined differently for each person.
Yeah.
The problem
unless
that
you,
I have,
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was going to say the problem that I have is that when someone says, but that's not a big deal.
Yeah. To them.
But for that person, it actually really is. It's perceived and felt in a big, harmful, distressing way.
Yeah, so for me, I am a very sensitive person. I was the youngest born, which sort of adds to that, or can add to that. And I was told over and over and over as a kid, don't be so sensitive. So that together made me could turn into a big T. Just being sensitive, not having it listened to, and being told it's a bad thing. Don't do that. Don't do that. Right. So all that did is make me hunker down and learn not to feel. And then 20 years of therapy to try to feel again because I
I
was so
hear
frozen.
you.
It took that long. Yeah. So there are these things that we can do to each other that we think we're sort of bucking that person up, and really we're causing harm. I think we're getting better about that. I mean, um, my dad has apologized to me about that already, So I'm like, I'm really, I had a lot of therapy. I'm not holding it over you anymore. But yeah, that sucked, right?
Yeah.
And it was inconvenient for them if I would cry about something.
Yeah.
Now, you have a kid that's wonderfully sensitive. It's one of the things that makes me so empathic and a bit of a scary mind reader with my clients. I know it's that same attribute.
Yep.
So we have to figure out ways to let people be who they are. And I think the world is doing a little bit better job of this than they were 50 years ago when I was a little thing, right?
Yeah.
Where you had to fit and do the right thing. And we weren't ever allowed to get out of our chair or wiggle our foot or do anything, right? We just had to sit there and pay attention and not move or
Right.
breathe or anything.
There was only one way to show that you were good. Like
Yeah,
that
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
idea. Yeah,
yeah.
I would agree, Dana. I mean, I think kind of going back to this, anyone that's listening to this, a lot of times I think when we talk about things, pay attention about self-awareness again. Here we go.
Yeah, yeah,
Pay
there it is.
attention to see if it resonates with you.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
like that resonance is a felt thing. It's not
Yeah.
a thought based thing
Yeah.
necessarily. It's
Yeah.
like the holy beep. That's it.
There it is.
There it is, or
Yeah.
gosh, or maybe it's like I never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
You
And why
know?
why why in the neurodiverse community do we see this so much? And I think it's because, we've already dispelled the myth of autistics aren't empathetic. In fact, we're uber
Yeah.
empathetic and
Overly, it's like an
super
empathy
sensitive.
rod.
Yeah, yeah.
Like a rod.
Oversensitive to
Yeah.
everything. Doesn't it make
Yeah, yeah.
sense that we'd be super sensitive to rejection?
Mhm.
And I've had people tell me when I've called them out, they're like, "Oh yeah, I did do that, but God, I wow, that had that effect on you." So it was a real thing. It really did happen, and I boom went to like explosion with this little thing that wasn't intended as that. And it's just, to me, it's almost like a sensory overload thing.
Mhm.
We're in tune to it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, here is some of the ableist assumptions about autistics, right? Okay, so
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
one, you don't feel things,
Nah.
right? There's no empathy happening. Two, you don't
Right.
want you don't pay attention to social relationships. You don't want
No.
those.
Don't need them. Don't need them. People. Blah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, like I'm not like, I'm being totally flippant, but not by
Yeah.
much. I
Yeah.
mean, I
Yeah.
hear that all the time. Those are some of the most common
Yeah.
ableist comments. And,
That's right.
listen, I've been there. I mean,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
in
I have too.
retrospect,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
like it's only because I'm trying to pay attention and trying to open my mind
Mm-hmm.
and being like, whoa, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Like, let me
Right.
understand this, And so,
Yeah. Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
this idea of like, how do we understand
Yeah.
versus make a judgment? Unfortunately,
Yeah.
that does take the generosity of attention.
Yeah. And the label to a certain extent. So if you have an understanding what the label is, then you can start asking about it. Oh, I heard
Yeah,
about this thing. Is
yeah,
this what's going on? I don't, that, so that language, labels really are just language, but obviously are marginalizing, but they can also be really good descriptors. And my fantasy is if this ever does make it into the DSM, they'll change the dysphoria, or they'll put disorder after the dysphoria because everything's disorder in there. They'll have
oh
to make it a
God,
disorder
yeah.
versus just this thing that happens, and let's just describe the experience.
Let's
Yeah.
just describe the experience because
Mm-hmm.
honestly, okay, like like Dana, as a therapist, why is this really helpful? Like in my mind,
Mm-hmm.
understanding this, the lived experience of an individual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding it like this, that helps me with the moves that I make in support.
Yeah, of
Right.
course.
So, right.
Yeah.
So then it's like, oh, I don't need to move to you implementing a coping
Yeah.
strategy in this moment where I have to coach you.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Yeah.
that is helpful, but maybe in this
Sure.
moment it's not. And that question
Yeah.
of how much time do you feel you need? Because
Mm-hmm.
I will be
Mm-hmm.
there in the muck, in the crap with you
Yeah. Yeah.
until that's done.
And
You
that's
know?
what's so restorative, right? I mean, getting over any trauma, it's just knowing that someone's in there with you,
Yeah,
right? It's all about
absolutely.
repairing that attachment and having someone walk through that with you. That's
Yeah,
what does it. Yeah.
yeah.
Can't do it.
Um,
Can't do it alone.
my nerdy, geeky mind goes to like because Captain America is like one of my favorites.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And he always says like, "I'm with you to the end of the line," and
Yeah, he does.
I
Yeah.
love that so much. Like
Yeah.
the relationships that he has with like the people in his life, he's so loyal to them,
Yeah.
and
I love
you
the
want to.
Mandalorian. It is the way.
It is
Same
the way,
idea
yeah,
though. It is the
yeah.
way. Yep.
Yeah. So this
Yeah.
is just really, so, if you're a therapist and you're understanding this in a different way, explore it with your clients in a different way.
Yeah.
If you yourself are like, whoa, holy cow, like, use it as a way to help someone understand.
Yeah.
Use it in your advocacy. That's where you can
Yes.
have your
Yes.
efficacy, actually. That's where you can have the control and make a difference.
That's right. That's right.
And like, if and maybe in the comments, if you're so inclined and it's not too uncomfortable, obviously, but to maybe talk about how you see rejection sensitivity dysphoria. What is it like?
Hmm.
What does it mean? Like, what does it mean to you? And obviously we want the comments to be positive. We don't want it to be, negative or judgy or but like
Oh, like
can
we don't want someone coming and saying this is a horrible thing, and I'm a
yeah.
therapist, and how dare you
Yeah,
talk
there's no
about
place
this?
for
Yeah.
that, really. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
there's not
Yeah.
a place
Yeah.
for that here for
Right.
us. It is a place of curiosity. If you want to
Yes.
share your
Exactly.
curiosities, that's great. And if there's something that you want Dana and I to talk about, to explore, I don't know, like leave it in the comments below as well. Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Well, we will see you, or you can hear us in the next episode. Thanks for being here.